Silence is most dangerous when a proud man mistakes it for surrender. At 7:40 on a cold Monday morning, Conrad Bexley walked into the glass-and-stone lobby of Blackwell Meridian Media as if the building had been waiting for his permission to breathe. The air smelled of expensive coffee, polished marble, and the faint metallic heat of machines already waking behind sealed newsroom doors. Near the private elevators, assistants spoke into encrypted phones, editors crossed the floor with tablets pressed to their chests, and somewhere beyond the security gates, a gold-plated pen scratched across a document that could move markets before breakfast. Conrad smiled. Beside him, Marissa Kane moved with the borrowed confidence of a woman who believed proximity to a billionaire was the same as power. Her blonde hair was arranged with surgical precision. Her cream suit was too bright for the hour, and her diamond bracelet caught the lobby lights each time she adjusted the strap of her handbag. She looked at the silent portraits on the wall, the old publishers, the old families, the old names carved into brass, and assumed they were all part of the world Conrad owned. She was wrong. Conrad did not come that morning to negotiate with his wife. He did not come to ask for a divorce, offer a settlement, or preserve even the illusion of respect. He came to bury Simone Blackwell before the city finished its first cup of coffee. By 9 o'clock, a story was supposed to go live across every digital channel of the institution, dressed as investigative journalism, but built like a blade. It suggested Simone had manipulated charitable accounts, exploited her marriage for influence, and quietly positioned herself as a threat to the Bexley legacy. Alike can wear a tailored suit. In the elevator, Conrad checked his reflection in the black glass and adjusted his cufflinks with the calm arrogance of a man who had ruined people before and slept well afterward. His phone vibrated with messages from advisors, lawyers, and public relations men who knew how to turn whispers into headlines without leaving fingerprints. One message read, "Editorial pressure holding. Release window intact." Conrad slipped the phone back into his jacket and glanced at Marissa, who gave him a small, satisfied smile. They both believed the morning belonged to them. Upstairs, the 42nd floor editorial conference room had already filled with quiet tension. Senior editors sat around a long gray stone table, their coffee untouched, their faces lit by muted screens displaying the unpublished headline. A compliance attorney stood near the wall, reading the same paragraph for the third time. The editor-in-chief did not look pleased, but Conrad mistook discomfort for obedience. He always had. "This needs to run before the markets open," Conrad said, placing one hand on the back of a chair he had not been invited to take. "The public deserves to know who Simone Blackwell really is." No one answered quickly. That silence should have warned him. Instead, it fed him. Conrad looked around the room and saw hesitation, fear, calculation, all the things he was used to purchasing. He did not see loyalty to Simone, because he did not believe loyalty could exist without money attached. He did not see the legal trap beneath the table, because he had never respected paper unless his own name was printed on it. And he did not see that every step he took into that room had already been recorded, time-stamped, preserved, and prepared. Then the doors opened at the far end of the hallway. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the room to change temperature. But Conrad did not turn around yet, because in his mind, Simone was still somewhere behind him, wounded, cornered, and already trapped inside the version of her he had paid others to print. On the 51st floor, Simone Blackwell stood beside a wall of glass while Manhattan lifted itself out of morning haze beneath her. She wore deep burgundy satin with the restraint of a woman who understood that elegance did not need permission, and pearl earrings that caught the pale light whenever she turned her head. On the desk before her sat a thin stack of documents, a sealed compliance notice, and a quiet screen showing the unpublished article Conrad believed would end her. She did not tremble. Helena Cross stood across from her, silver-haired, composed, holding the legal summary with both hands as if it were not a weapon but a weather report. Outside the glass, traffic moved like small, obedient lines through the city, indifferent to reputation, marriage, betrayal, and the expensive cruelty of men who mistook access for ownership. In the room, the only sound was the soft hum of climate control and the distant vibration of encrypted calls moving through the building below. Simone read one paragraph. The article did not accuse her directly at first. It performed something more polished and more poisonous. Implication, anonymous sourcing, financial insinuation, charitable distortion, the kind of language designed to stain without ever standing close enough to be struck. It was cowardice with punctuation. Helena waited for anger, but Simone gave none. She moved one page aside, then another, her eyes calm, her expression neither wounded nor surprised. There are betrayals that arrive like storms, and there are betrayals that arrive wearing legal formatting, confident they will be mistaken for truth. Simone had known Conrad long enough to recognize the second kind. "He signed?" she asked. Helena nodded once. Every authorization trail, every pressure note, every release approval. Simone placed the page down with careful fingers. Good. That was all. No speech about marriage. No plea about loyalty. No question about Marissa. Simone did not waste language on people who had already confessed through their choices. She walked to the edge of the desk and looked again at the screen, where her name sat inside a headline shaped to humiliate her before the market opened. Conrad thought her silence meant she had no defense ready, but silence had always been the cleanest room in Simone's mind. She could see the whole board from there. Below, on the 42nd floor, Conrad was leaning into a chair that was not his, pressing the room toward publication, performing control for the woman behind him. Above him, Simone was not performing anything. She was measuring. Helena opened the next document and placed it gently on the desk. The controlling vote certificate, the ownership trust diagram, the editorial ethics injunction, and a redline publishing agreement showing Conrad's fingerprints all over the machinery of the lie. "We can stop it before it goes live," Helena said. Simone looked at the documents, then at the city. No, Helena studied her for a moment. The answer was not emotional. It was procedural. Simone did not want the lie published, but she wanted the attempt preserved in front of witnesses. The room needed to see the difference between a husband seeking truth and a man weaponizing a newsroom because his pride had been injured. Conrad needed to stand under the weight of his own signature. "Let him finish walking," Simone said. Helena closed the folder halfway, understanding at once. Downstairs, the editors would feel the pressure sharpen. Conrad would push harder. Marissa would smile too soon. Every person in that conference room would watch him choose abuse of influence over editorial integrity, and no one would need Simone to explain what kind of man he was. Truth does not always need a voice. Sometimes it only needs witnesses. Simone turned from the window at last, her face calm enough to frighten anyone who knew what real power looked like. "Now," she said. Helena Cross picked up the documents and moved toward the door. By the time the elevator doors opened below, Conrad still believed he had trapped his wife inside a story. He had no idea she had already turned the story into evidence. Before Conrad ever learned to fear Simone's silence, he had mistaken it for gratitude. Years earlier, when their marriage was still polished enough for magazine covers and charity luncheons, he introduced her to rooms as if he had personally unlocked them. He would place one hand at the small of her back, smile for cameras, and say her name with the possessive ease of a man presenting a rare acquisition to people who measured value by proximity. Simone always smiled. In those early years, Conrad believed he was teaching her the rules of wealth, which donors mattered, which board members could be pressured, which editors liked private access, which investors needed flattery before they moved capital. He spoke often, loudly, confidently, leaning over dinner tables and conference banquets, as if every sentence were a decree. Simone listened. That was his first mistake. He thought listening meant learning from him, not studying him. He never noticed how she remembered every careless boast, every name he dropped, every contract he dismissed as a standard language, every lawyer he mocked for being too cautious. He did not understand that a quiet woman in a room of arrogant men hears more than anyone intends to give away. She heard everything. Conrad had built his image on motion and noise. Acquisitions announced before sunrise, interviews arranged through private publicists, phone calls taken in glass elevators, signatures made with theatrical impatience while assistants waited nearby. He liked the theater of business more than the discipline of it. When he signed, he rarely read the final page. When he bought influence, he assumed influence stayed bought. When someone warned him about ownership structure, fiduciary duty, or editorial independence, he smiled as though legal language were furniture arranged for lesser men. Simone never corrected him. At a private breakfast 2 years into the marriage, he once told her that reputation was simple. Control the room, control the story, he said, cutting into toast he did not finish. Simone looked at him over her coffee. Not always. He laughed thin, soft, and dismissive, because he thought she was being philosophical instead of precise. That was his second mistake. Long before Conrad attached his name to hers, the Blackwell family had understood that public attention was a dangerous currency. They did not chase headlines. They owned the structures that decided which headlines deserved oxygen. Blackwell Meridian Media had survived lawsuits, recessions, hostile investors, and political pressure because the family trust behind it valued control more than applause. Simone had grown up around conversations Conrad would have found boring: voting thresholds, trustee succession, editorial firewalls, debt restructuring, independent oversight, reputational risk. Quiet clauses keep empires alive. She had studied law not to perform brilliance, but to make sure no one could mistake elegance for permission. She learned how ownership could hide in plain sight. She learned how a signature could become a confession. She learned that the most dangerous clause in a contract was often the one an arrogant man skipped because it looked ordinary. Conrad never asked. He preferred the version of Simone that made him feel generous, the elegant wife beside him at fundraisers, the calm presence in photographs, the woman who did not interrupt when he exaggerated his reach. He mistook restraint for dependence, and dependence for permission. Over time, his compliments became smaller and sharper. He praised her dress, but not her judgment. He mentioned her grace, but not her intelligence. He told friends she had adjusted beautifully to his world, never suspecting he was standing in hers. Simone let him speak. Not because it did not wound her, because correction would have educated him. And Simone had learned long ago that some men reveal themselves only when they are allowed to believe no one is keeping score. By the time Conrad decided to turn a newsroom against her, his downfall had already been written in years of ignored details. Every belittling joke, every skipped clause, every assumption that she owed him her name had prepared the ground beneath his feet. He thought he had married a woman who could be erased. He had married the woman who owned the place where his lies would have to ask permission to become ink. Conrad's decision to destroy Simone did not begin with rage. It began with inconvenience. She had stopped attending his dinners, stopped correcting his public exaggerations with a polite smile, stopped appearing beside him whenever his advisors needed her elegance to soften his arrogance. To Conrad, a wife who no longer performed loyalty in public had become a threat. So he turned to the only religion he truly trusted: image. The first meeting happened behind frosted glass in a communications suite overlooking Madison Avenue, where the coffee came in porcelain cups and every phone on the table was encrypted. Conrad sat at the head of a table he had rented for 2 hours and treated it like a throne. Around him were crisis consultants, reputation strategists, a former magazine editor, and 2 attorneys who understood how to make dangerous things look neutral on paper. Marissa sat near the window, legs crossed, watching the men build Simone's humiliation as if it were a campaign launch. She enjoyed the polish of it. A crude lie would have been easy to kill, so Conrad wanted something smoother. The story would not scream that Simone was corrupt. It would imply she had unanswered questions. Instead of accusing her of theft, it would suggest irregularities in charitable transfers she had personally saved from donor mismanagement years earlier. Instead of calling her unstable, it would quote unnamed social sources who worried about her increasing isolation and unusual control over private decisions. Poison works best when it sounds concerned. Conrad approved the language because it felt clean to him, almost respectable. He told himself he was not lying, only revealing a pattern. He told his advisors the public had a right to know who had been standing beside him all those years. He told Marissa that once the peace landed, Simone would spend months defending herself instead of negotiating from strength. Marissa smiled without looking away from the glass. "Then people will finally see her properly," she said. Conrad did not correct her. That was the point. Meanwhile, Simone watched the architecture of the attack form from above, not through gossip, but through compliance alerts, source verification memos, embargo queue changes, and flag communication trails. Every pressure note from Bexley Holdings. Every call to an advertising liaison. Every request to move the article ahead of legal review. Every phrase inserted to wound while pretending to investigate. The newsroom had rules. Conrad had mistaken rules for obstacles other people obeyed. At 6:30 that morning, Helena Cross delivered the latest summary to Simone's office, where the city still looked blue and unfinished beyond the glass. Simone read the highlighted sections without changing expression. Conrad had used 3 external consultants, 1 friendly investor, and a threatened advertising withdrawal to push the piece forward. He had also allowed Marissa's assistant to feed private domestic details to a freelance contributor, creating a chain so reckless it was almost merciful. Helena waited. Simone placed the page down. Preserve it. Nothing more. Downstairs, the campaign sharpened. Conrad's people asked for a stronger headline, a colder photograph, a release time chosen to dominate the morning cycle before markets and rival outlets could respond. They wanted Simone trapped in speed, buried under questions, forced into defensive statements that would make her look guilty no matter what she said. They did not understand that she had no intention of defending herself on their schedule. She had learned the rhythm of men like Conrad. They strike early, speak first, demand reaction, then call every refusal to panic and admission. Simone refused the rhythm. By the time Conrad entered the media house with Marissa at his side, the article was ready, the room was tense, and his fingerprints were everywhere. He thought he had built a weapon with distance between himself and the blade. But the blade had his name engraved along the handle. By 8:52, the 42nd floor conference room had become too still for Conrad's liking. The unpublished article glowed on the main screen, its headline waiting like a blade under glass, while senior editors sat with the strained composure of people being asked to betray their own profession in front of witnesses. The coffee had gone cold in porcelain cups, encrypted phones blinked silently beside legal pads, and a gold-trimmed pen lay near Conrad's hand, as if the room itself were offering him one final chance to choose caution. He did not take it. "We are past caution," Conrad said, his voice smooth enough to sound reasonable and hard enough to make the junior staff avoid his eyes. He reminded them of advertising commitments, investor relationships, private access, future interviews, all the soft currencies men like him used when they wanted obedience without calling it purchase. Marissa sat behind him with a faint smile, already imagining the morning headlines cutting Simone down to a size she could understand. She mistook silence for surrender too. The editor-in-chief, Martin Keene, adjusted his glasses and looked toward the compliance attorney near the wall. "There are unresolved source issues," he said carefully. Conrad turned to him with the practiced disappointment of a donor hearing the word no. He did not shout, because shouting would have made him look vulgar. Instead, he lowered his voice until it carried more threat than volume. "Then resolve them." The room tightened. A communications advisor slid a document across the table, describing it as a routine authorization trail, a confirmation that outside sourcing had been reviewed, that the release had stakeholder approval, that any reputational challenge would be handled by external counsel. The language looked formal, harmless, almost boring. That was why Conrad barely read it. Boring paper ruins arrogant men. He skimmed the first page, skipped the second, and landed on the final signature block with impatience already moving through his fingers. The pen felt expensive in his hand, heavy, ceremonial, designed for men who believed ink was a kind of command. He signed once, then again, then initialed the margin where the advisor pointed. Each stroke sounded small against the stone table. Each one converted arrogance into evidence. Upstairs, Simone stood beside Helena Cross, watching the authorization log update in real time on a secure internal screen. A timestamp appeared, then another. Then Conrad's full name locked beside the release approval chain. Helena looked at Simone, waiting for the order that would end it before the damage could spread. Simone's face remained calm. "Complete?" she asked. "Complete," Helena said. Simone looked at the screen for one silent second longer. "Go." No anger. No performance. Just the turning of a key. Downstairs, Conrad pushed the signed document back as if he had just purchased the room. "Now publish it," he said. No one moved. That pause irritated him more than open resistance would have, because open resistance gave him something to crush. This was different. This was a room slowly realizing the most powerful man at the table might not be powerful at all. Marissa leaned forward, her diamond bracelet flashing under the conference lights. "Is there another problem?" she asked, with the brittle sweetness of someone who had borrowed authority and begun to spend it too publicly. The compliance attorney did not answer her. Martin Keene looked at the screen, then at the door, then at the document Conrad had just signed. Conrad followed his gaze too late. At the far end of the hallway, elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Helena Cross stepped out holding the controlling vote certificate, the editorial ethics injunction, and the ownership trust diagram in a narrow steel gray case. She did not hurry. She did not need to. Conrad saw her through the glass wall and frowned, annoyed by a woman he had always considered a legal functionary arriving without his permission. He still believed permission was his to give. That was the final mercy before humiliation. The room watched Helena approach, and in the silence before she entered, Conrad glanced once at the signed authorization trail resting on the table. For the first time that morning, he seemed to sense that the document had not protected him. It had identified him. Helena Cross entered the conference room with the kind of calm that made every raised voice seem childish before it even began. She wore a charcoal suit, carried the steel gray case in one hand, and paused just long enough for every person at the table to understand that the morning had changed ownership. The screen still showed the unpublished article. Conrad's signed authorization trail sat beside the gold-trimmed pen, and the room smelled of cold coffee, expensive leather chairs, and the dry electricity of encrypted phones waiting for instructions no one was brave enough to send. Then Helena closed the door. Conrad straightened slowly, irritated by her composure because it did not acknowledge his importance. "This meeting is private," he said, looking at Martin Keene first, then at Helena, as if the editor-in-chief might remove her for him. Nobody moved. That was the first insult. Helena placed the case on the table and opened it without haste. Inside were 3 documents arranged with surgical neatness: the editorial ethics injunction, the ownership trust diagram, and the controlling vote certificate bearing Simone Blackwell's name with the quiet violence of legal fact. Conrad looked at the papers, then laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because arrogance often tries to become sound before it becomes fear. "You can't block a story because my wife dislikes it," he said. Helena looked at him. "This is not about dislike." The sentence landed softly. It cut anyway. Around the table, editors lowered their eyes toward the certificate. Martin Keene removed his glasses, cleaned them with a folded cloth, and did not put them back on. The compliance attorney stepped closer to the wall, as if distance might save him from the blast radius of Conrad's mistake. Marissa's smile weakened, but she held it in place a moment too long, the way people do when they still believe elegance can outrun exposure. It could not. Helena turned the first document toward Conrad. "The article is suspended under the editorial firewall clause and conflict of interest review." Conrad's jaw tightened. "On whose authority?" Helena moved the second document forward. "The controlling owners." For 1 second, Conrad looked almost bored, as if expecting the name of some committee chair he could threaten by lunch. Then his eyes found Simone's name printed cleanly across the certificate, followed by voting control, appointment rights, veto authority over conflicted editorial campaigns, and emergency suspension power. His confidence thinned. Not all at once, just enough for the room to hear it. Marissa leaned forward, confused now in a way diamonds could not disguise. "That can't be right," she said. Helena did not look at her. "It is." Conrad reached for the ownership trust diagram, scanning lines he should have respected years earlier. The structure was not new, not rushed, not created for revenge. It had existed before his marriage, before his influence, before the public ever paired his name with Simone's. Blackwell family trusts, independent editorial protections, voting rights, succession provisions, all connected with the cruel simplicity of a truth he had never bothered to ask about. He had reached for a weapon that had been locked in her name all along. Helena slid the signed authorization trail beside the certificate. The 2 documents looked obscene together: his attempt and her authority, his arrogance and her ownership, his ink and her inheritance. "You pressured this newsroom to attack its controlling owner," Helena said. "That is the conflict." Conrad's eyes flashed, searching for a way back to command. "Simone put you up to this." The door opened again. Simone stepped in. She did not rush, did not glare, did not look wounded enough to satisfy him. Her presence rearranged the room without asking permission. Conrad turned toward her, anger rising because anger was the last expensive thing he still had. "Say something," he demanded. Simone looked at the article on the screen, then at his signature on the authorization trail. "You already did." The room went silent in a way Conrad could not purchase, redirect, or survive. Helena closed the case softly, leaving the documents on the table. The story he had built against Simone had not gone live, but its purpose had been fulfilled. Everyone who mattered had seen the man behind it. The first person to abandon Conrad was not an enemy. It was Martin Keene, the editor-in-chief, a careful man who had spent 30 years learning that truth only becomes expensive when powerful people try to bend it. He stood slowly, placed both hands on the stone table, and looked not at Conrad, but at Helena Cross. "Editorial will not proceed," he said. Conrad turned toward him with disbelief sharpened into insult. For years, men had stepped aside when he looked at them that way. That morning, no one did. Martin continued, his voice low but steady, confirming that the article would be placed under formal review, all outside sourcing would be audited, and every communication from Bexley Holdings would be preserved. Around the table, the senior editors began closing their laptops with small, final sounds. One by one. Not loudly, not rebelliously, just enough to tell Conrad that the room had stopped belonging to him. Marissa looked from face to face, searching for the fear that had made her confident minutes earlier. She found caution, revulsion, and professional self-preservation. No admiration. A communications advisor slid his phone into his pocket and stepped back from Conrad's chair. One of the attorneys whispered to another and gathered his papers without asking permission. The compliance officer opened a secure incident log and began documenting the meeting in real time. Conrad watched the machinery of consequence begin to move, and for the first time, he understood that silence could be administrative, not passive. It was processing him. Then the calls began. An advertising partner requested an immediate pause on all Bexley-linked placements pending conflict review. A board member asked to be connected to independent counsel. A senior investor, who had once laughed too loudly at Conrad's dinners, sent a message asking whether Blackwell Meridian Media needed a public statement distancing itself from external pressure. The allies did not denounce him. They did something colder. They protected themselves. Conrad reached for his phone and called his chief strategist. The call rang once, then diverted. He called his public relations lead. No answer. He called a partner at a law firm that had billed him millions over the years. A junior associate replied by text, advising that all future communication should go through formal counsel. That was how privilege died in rich rooms, not with shouting, but with unanswered calls. Marissa stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor with more drama than anyone else had allowed themselves. "This is absurd," she said, too brightly. Conrad was invited here. Helena finally looked at her. "You were not." The sentence erased the borrowed authority from Marissa's face. A security director entered quietly and asked Marissa to surrender her temporary visitor credential because she had no legal, editorial, or board standing in the meeting. Marissa looked to Conrad for rescue, but Conrad was still staring at his phone, watching one ally after another step out of reach. The badge in her hand, glossy and useless, suddenly looked more honest than her diamonds. She had dressed that morning like a woman entering a throne room. She left like someone whose invitation had expired before she understood who owned the door. Simone did not watch her go. She stood near the far end of the table, calm, unreachable, her eyes on the documents rather than the humiliation blooming around them. Conrad wanted her to gloat, because gloating would make her smaller, familiar, easier to hate. She gave him nothing. That was worse. "You planned this," he said, his voice rougher now. Simone looked at him. "You signed it." No explanation followed. None was needed. Helena instructed the compliance team to revoke Conrad's visitor privileges, freeze access requests tied to Bexley Holdings, and place every pending communications contract under conflict review. The editor-in-chief ordered the newsroom not to engage with any source connected to the attempted article until independent review concluded. Legal staff collected the signed authorization trail in evidence sleeves. The gold-trimmed pen remained on the table, suddenly ridiculous. Conrad stood in the center of the room, still wearing the suit, the watch, the name, the wealth, and none of the command. Outside the glass wall, the newsroom continued working. Headlines moved. Markets opened. The world did not pause for his disgrace. The newsroom kept breathing without him. He had tried to make Simone's name the morning spectacle, but the only reputation collapsing in that room was his own. and everyone who had once benefited from standing near him had begun, with perfect manners, to step away. By 9:18, the conference room had emptied of everyone who no longer wished to be seen choosing Conrad. The senior editors returned to the newsroom. The attorneys moved toward independent review. The compliance staff sealed the authorization trail, and Marissa's sharp perfume faded from the air after security escorted her past the glass doors. What remained was quieter and more punishing. Conrad, Simone, Helena, the dark screen, the cold coffee, and the document with his signature resting beside the certificate that made his signature worthless. Silence took the chair he thought was his. Conrad stood near the end of the stone table, his anger no longer clean enough to look like authority. He had lost the crowd, the room, the article, the mistress's borrowed confidence, and the comforting illusion that money made every institution kneel. Yet pride fought to survive inside him, searching for one last version of the morning in which he could still call himself wronged. "You humiliated me," he said. Simone looked at him without moving closer. "You brought the proof with you." The words were soft. They landed like evidence. Conrad's face tightened because he understood her meaning before he wanted to admit it. He had walked into the building already carrying his own disgrace. The pressure notes, the manipulated sourcing, the threatened advertising pull, the external consultants, the authorization chain, the contempt for a woman whose name he thought he could reduce to a headline. Simone had not exposed him by invention. She had simply stopped protecting him from the truth of his own conduct. That was unforgivable to a man who believed consequences were for people without counsel. Helena placed another document on the table, this one a formal notice suspending all informal access between Bexley Holdings and the media group pending review. It revoked Conrad's executive visitor privileges, disabled his secure guest credential, terminated advisory courtesies, froze active influence channels, and required all future communication to pass through independent legal representation. Somewhere beyond the glass, a security system updated his status without drama. Access denied. The language was bloodless. That made it brutal. Conrad stared at the notice as if it were a physical insult. "You can't cut me out of rooms I helped build," he said. Simone glanced at the ownership diagram. "You visited." Nothing more. The distinction destroyed him more effectively than accusation would have. He had mistaken invitation for ownership, proximity for control, marriage for entitlement. Every door that had opened for him in this building had opened because Simone allowed courtesy to masquerade as status. Now courtesy had ended. Helena continued reading the measures in her measured voice. Editorial firewall protection strengthened, board-level ethics inquiry initiated, donor and advertiser influence logs preserved, personnel shielded from retaliatory pressure, public statement prepared but restrained. No scandalous language. No revenge language. Only governance. This was how Simone fought, not with volume, but with systems that survived volume. Conrad looked at her then, truly looked, perhaps for the first time that morning. She was not triumphant. She was not wounded. She was not the frantic wife he had expected to corner. She was a woman standing inside her own authority, calm enough to make his rage seem poor. "Was any of it ever mine?" he asked, and the question carried more fear than anger. Simone held his gaze. No, a single syllable. A closed door. The screen behind him went black, erasing the unpublished headline and leaving only his reflection suspended in the glass. He saw himself surrounded by documents he had not read, rules he had dismissed, and people he could no longer summon. The empire of noise he had trusted had gone silent around him. Simone turned to Helena. "Proceed." Helena nodded and gathered the signed papers into the evidence file. Conrad reached as if to stop her, then stopped himself when he saw the security director waiting beyond the glass. No one threatened him. No one needed to. The humiliation was complete because it was orderly. Simone walked past him toward the door, close enough for him to smell the faint trace of her perfume, composed and expensive and already beyond him. He wanted a final argument, a wound he could point to, a dramatic cruelty he could retell later as proof that she had destroyed him. She gave him only the truth, and the truth gave him nowhere to hide. Conrad remained by the conference table after Simone reached the door, as if the room might return something to him if he stood still long enough. The black screen reflected his face in fragments. The billionaire who had arrived with certainty, the husband who had mistaken cruelty for strategy, The man who had tried to turn a newsroom into a knife and discovered too late that the handle belonged to someone else. Behind him, Helena Cross sealed the evidence file, and the soft click of the clasp sounded more final than any shouted verdict could have. Conrad looked at Simone's back. "You're just going to walk away?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the polish he had worn into the building. Simone paused. She did not turn immediately. Outside the glass walls, the newsroom continued its disciplined rhythm. Editors moving between desks, phones vibrating under muted screens, market numbers changing, coffee cooling, stories being weighed by people who still understood that truth had a cost. The world had not ended. Only Conrad's version of it had. At the far side of the room, the gold-trimmed pen still lay on the stone table, useless now, no longer an instrument of command but a small, shining reminder of how cheaply arrogance signs itself into evidence. Helena watched in silence, allowing the final wound to belong to Simone alone. Conrad tried one last time to gather himself into the shape of a powerful man. "You wouldn't have had this name without me," he said. The sentence was old, ugly, and desperate. It carried every assumption he had ever made about her. That marriage had elevated her, that his fame had defined her, that his money had purchased the right to rewrite her worth. Simone finally turned. Her expression was calm, almost merciful, but there was no softness left for him to misuse. She looked at the ownership certificate, then at the dead article on the screen, then at the man who had confused possession with power for far too long. "Conrad," she said quietly, "you didn't give me a name. You were a guest in mine." Nothing in the room moved. Volume would have weakened it. It took the last beautiful lie from him and left only the truth. He had not created her, protected her, owned her, or understood the world he had entered. Simone did not wait for his answer. She gave Helena one small nod, then walked out with the steady dignity of a woman who had never needed revenge to prove her power, only the patience to let a proud man reveal himself. In the hallway, staff members stepped aside not out of fear, but respect. By 10 o'clock, Conrad's visitor access had been revoked, Bexley-linked media contracts were under formal review, and an internal ethics inquiry had begun. By noon, a restrained public statement reaffirmed editorial independence, transparent governance, and protection against private influence. His name was not dragged through the mud. She had no interest in giving his disgrace the dignity of spectacle. Instead, he was left to understand that exclusion from power can be more humiliating than public scandal. Marissa's calls went unanswered. His advisors requested distance. His partners asked for documentation. The doors that had opened because of Simone closed without apology. And somewhere above the city, in a quiet office filled with pale morning light, Simone Blackwell signed the final governance order while the board's secretary logged it into the company record. The order protected the editorial firewall, restricted private influence channels, and removed every courtesy that had allowed Conrad to mistake access for control. Then she removed her wedding ring, placed it beside the unsigned scandal proof, and walked toward the elevator without looking back. The door closed softly, and the empire kept moving without him. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.